Relax and listen to the voice. A 15-year-old girl named Donna lived with her father in a small house in the suburbs. Ever since her mother died, Donna had depended on her father for everything. They had a wonderful relationship and loved each other very much. One morning, Donna's father was leaving on a business trip. As they ate breakfast together, he told her that he would be home very late that night. With that, he kissed her on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the front door. Later that day, when Donna came home from school, she did some homework and watched some TV. By midnight, her father had still not returned, so she decided to go to bed. That night she had a dream. She found herself standing at the edge of a busy highway. Cars and trucks whizzed by at an alarming rate. She looked across the highway and saw a familiar figure standing on the other side. It was her father. His hands were cupped around his mouth and he seemed to be shouting something to her, but she was unable to make out what he was saying. As the traffic whizzed by, she strained to hear. Her father's eyes looked very sad. He seemed to be desperately trying to communicate something to her. She could barely make out the words. Don't open door. Suddenly, Donna was awoken from a dream by a strange tapping noise. Tap, tap, tap. Then somebody began to ring their doorbell downstairs. Ring, ring, ring. She scrambled out of bed and put on her slippers. Then, dressed only in her nightgown, she ran downstairs and went to the front door. Looking through the peephole, she saw her father's face outside. He was staring right at her. The doorbell kept ringing insistently. "Okay, hold on, I'm coming," she shouted. She pulled back the deadbolt and was about to unlatch the door when she stopped. She looked through the peephole again at her father. Something about his expression just didn't quite look right. His eyes were wide open. He looked absolutely terrified. She slowly and quietly slid the deadbolt back into place. "Dad?" she yelled through the door. "Did you forget your keys?" The doorbell began to ring again. Ring, 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 ring. "Dad, answer me!" The doorbell kept ringing incessantly. "Dad, please, I need you to answer me. Is there somebody out there with you?" Ring, 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 ring. "Why won't you answer me?" Ring, 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 ring. "I'm not opening the door until you say something." The doorbell kept ringing and ringing, but for some reason, her father refused to answer her desperate cries. For the rest of the night, the frightened girl cowered in a corner of the hallway, helplessly listening to the ceaseless ringing of the doorbell. It seemed to go on for hours. Eventually, at some point, somehow, she fell into an uneasy sleep. At dawn, she woke up and realized that everything was quiet. She crept over to the door and looked through the peephole again. Her father was still there, staring directly at her. She cautiously opened the door and was confronted with a sight that filled her with unimaginable horror. Her father's severed head was hanging from a nail above the door. There was a note attached to the doorbell. In a crude, scrawled handwriting, it read, "Good work, clever girl." Samantha had two best friends named Jenny and Amber. Her father was taking her on a weekend vacation, and she invited them to come along. Her family owned a cabin in the woods, and on Friday evening, her father drove the girls up there. "You see that lake?" asked Samantha when they arrived. "That's Lake Samantha. My dad grew up here. He loved it so much, he named me after it." That night, after they had unpacked their things, the three girls sat around and thought of ways to amuse themselves. "Does anyone have any spooky stories?" asked Amber. "I have one," said Jenny. "It's a true story, too. It happened to a friend of mine. She was babysitting these two little kids one night. She's sitting in the dark all by herself, watching TV, and the phone rings. She goes over and she answers it, and she hears a voice on the other end breathing really heavy, and it says, "Have you checked on the children?" "Jenny, come on," Amber interrupted. "Everybody's heard that one. That's the lamest scary story ever. Does anyone else have a story? One that's like actually scary and actually true?" "I know one," Samantha said. "About a 10-minute hike from here, there's an old broken down house. We passed it on the way up here. It's out in the middle of nowhere, tucked away off of a narrow little side road. Anyway, a long time ago, a man lived there. His family were really wealthy, and they owned hundreds of acres of land around here. This man met a simple country girl from a simple country town, and they fell in love. His family wasn't very happy about it. They didn't think the girl was good enough for him, but he just ignored him. He was an independent type of guy, and he went off and built a little house on a chunk of their land out in the middle of nowhere. He married this girl, and everything was wonderful for both of them. They had a daughter, and then they eventually had a son. This is kind of where the story starts to go bad. The son was sick, not physically, but like mentally. He was sick in the head. He wasn't mentally disabled or anything, he was just a little off. By the time he was 9 years old, he became too much for his parents to handle. He was always throwing temper tantrums, and he had erratic sleeping patterns. He would go disappear into the woods and hide, like that kind of stuff. The man didn't know what to do about his son, so he turned to his family and asked them for help. His parents had the boy taken away, and they sent him to a place deep in the woods. It wasn't an insane asylum, but it catered to people with special needs, if you know what I mean. His parents thought it was for the best. Over time, the family got used to not having him around. They gradually stopped visiting him, and they functioned as if they had never even had a son, and everything went back to being wonderful again. 8 years later, the boy, who was about 16 or 17 at this time, he managed to escape from the hospital. The hospital staff did a huge search, but he was nowhere to be found. His family was notified, and they were devastated. They were worried for his safety. He'd been out there alone in the wilderness for weeks, and he was probably dead. But the boy wasn't dead. One night, he found his way back home. He crept into his house, and one by one, he began to slaughter his entire family. His father, his mother, his sister, chopped them all to pieces. With the blood still dripping from his axe, he disappeared into the woods. When the grisly remains of his family were discovered a few days later, the townsfolk in the surrounding area were horrified. The police tried to find the boy, but it was no use. To this day, he's never been found. Since then, every year, around harvest time, people have started to go missing, and in their place, a corn-husk doll would be left behind. Legend has it that the boy still roams the woods around these parts. The surrounding towns have bought into the legend also, and they hang the dolls by their front door for protection. They say if the boy sees a doll hanging from the door of a house, he will pass by that house and leave the residents in peace. Nobody knows whether it's true or not, but there's a doll hanging from the door of every house in town. "That's so creepy," cried Jenny. "Do you guys have a doll on your door?" "Of course," said Samantha. "My dad says he doesn't believe the legend, but we hung one just in case." "I think I just soiled my underwear," said Amber. "Apparently the house is still haunted by the ghost of his murdered family too, and if you go up there late at night, you can hear the whole thing take place all over again." "Do you think we could go up there?" Jenny asked. "Sure," said Samantha. "But tomorrow, during daylight. There's no sense in tempting fate." That night the girls slept in the same room and huddled together, trying to pretend they weren't frightened by the story and expecting to hear something tapping at the window at any moment. The next morning, Samantha's father made them all a big breakfast, and they went down to the lake for a swim. Around noon, they decided to make a trip to the old haunted house. When they got there, the girls sensed an eerie presence in the old, dilapidated place. It was enough to make their skin crawl. They explored the ruins of the old house, peeking into corners and sifting through the rubble. After a while, Samantha spotted something half buried in the dirt. It was some sort of book. She dug the book out and dusted it off. The girls gathered around as she opened it up and began to flip through the yellowed pages. "It's like a diary or something," said Samantha. "Maybe it's his diary," Jenny whispered. "Whose diary?" asked Amber. "The guy," said Jenny. "The guy that killed his family." Samantha read the diary aloud as the others listened. "There's a dedication inscribed here in the cover. It reads, 'To my family who I love and I cherish, and who will always be with me. September 5th, 1987. It has been hard alone. All they had to do was talk to me. They couldn't even talk to me. I hear their voices late at night sometimes. I hear their screams. It's cold and it's dark. I just needed love, but they didn't love me. The medicines are gone. I'm free. I'm free from all of them. If they couldn't love me, they had to go. Dark sleep for everyone. I hear their voices still, always screaming.'" December 4th, 1987. "They've stopped looking for me. It's okay for me now. I live in the forest. I chase down the animals and I put them in dark sleep, just like Mom and Dad and Sis. I visit my old house at night. I listen to the voices. At least they talk to me now." October 3rd, 1995. "I left the forest years ago and moved to a small town nearby. Nobody even recognizes me. No one knows who I am. I hear people telling my story sometimes. It makes me laugh inside. They all fear me. I still come to the forest sometimes. I spend the nights in my old house. Mom and Dad still talk to me. They say that they're very proud of me." November 2nd, 1998. "Life has been really good. I found a job. I bought a house. I met a girl. She's very quiet and pretty. Sometimes I bring her here to the forest. She likes it. I let Mom and Dad see her. They like her too." July 1st, 2000. "Today is a great day. I have a baby now. I'm so happy. Mom and Dad are grandparents now. My wife isn't doing so well though. It was really hard for her. She might not make it. Maybe she will go into a dark sleep. I'm happy now." August 13th, 2010. "I'm so proud of my child. She's just like me, except she's much smarter. She has no problems. She doesn't hear the voices. She goes to school and she has lots of friends. She's not like me. Sometimes I take her to the woods. I love her so much I named her after the lake, Samantha." For a few moments after Samantha stopped reading, there was stunned silence. "What the heck?" cried Jenny. "Samantha, is this some sort of joke?" Amber asked nervously. "If it is, it isn't funny." This can't be true," Samantha whispered. "It couldn't possibly be." Just then they heard the sound of twigs snapping behind them. When they turned around, they saw Samantha's father standing there. There was a strange, pained look on his face, and he was holding an axe in his hands. "You weren't supposed to find that," he muttered. "There's no other way now. Dark sleep for everyone." "No, Dad!" Samantha screamed. "No, no, no!" When Samantha's father had finished chopping up the bodies, he put the pieces in a large plastic bag and buried them deep in the woods, so deep that no one would ever find them. Now they could be together forever. "I'll watch over you now," he mumbled as he patted down the earth with his shovel. "You may not understand now, but you will in time. This is the only way for us to be together. All of us. Dark sleep forever. We all stay together. There was a girl named Mila whose parents were sending her away to summer camp. She had heard vague rumors from the other kids at school about strange things that went on at the camp. She pleaded with her parents to let her stay home for the summer, but they forced her to go. "You're 12 years old now, Mila," her father said sternly. "You need to get over this kind of nonsense and act like an adult." When Mila arrived at the camp, she was shocked to find it in such a dilapidated state. The wooden cabins were infested with termites, the bunk beds were lumpy and uncomfortable, the bed sheets smelled revolting, and the mattresses were covered in big yellow stains. There was only one toilet in the whole camp, and it was outdoors. It was little more than a wooden hut with several stalls inside. They looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months, and the stench was atrocious. Worst of all, the door of each stalls had a hole in it, cut in the shape of a heart. You had to stuff the hole with toilet paper every time you went to the bathroom, or else the other kids would be able to peek in and watch you. Despite the deplorable conditions, Mila managed to make friends with a few other girls. Late one night, after lights out, Mila and her friend Svetlana went out to the toilet. Mila decided to wait outside for her friend to finish. She strolled around, listening to the wind blowing through the trees and looking up at the stars. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a shadow moving towards the forest. She only caught a glimpse of it for a second before it disappeared into the trees, but it seemed to be the shadow of a man. She dismissed it as a trick of the light and went back to the outdoor toilets. Mila knocked on the bathroom door and told her friend to hurry up. There was no answer. She opened the door and went inside, but all the stalls were empty. Mila was a little offended because she assumed that her friend had gone back to the cabin without her. However, when she got back to the cabin, she found Svetlana's bed empty. She still hadn't returned and nobody knew where she was. The girls waited for an hour, but then they started to get worried. Mila woke their counselor up and told him Svetlana had disappeared. The entire camp was roused out of bed, and all of them went out to look for the missing girl. The counselor went into the toilet with a flashlight and searched each stall, but there was no sign of Svetlana. On the floor, he happened to notice a playing card. It was the Jack of Hearts. The counselor spent all night long looking for the missing girl, but she was nowhere to be found. Someone suggested that she might have run away from the camp. Her parents were called, and they were also quite worried. By the next morning, when the girl had still not shown up, they called in the police, but they also failed to find her. The other kids were terrified by the girl's disappearance, and many of them wanted to go home. Some children called their parents and persuaded them to come pick them up. The staff at the summer camp tried to calm everybody down. It was decided that after lights out, nobody could go use the toilet unless they were accompanied by an adult. Counselors insisted on this as they wanted to make sure that the other children didn't mysteriously disappear as well. That night, a girl named Aniska desperately needed to go to the toilet. She told one of the counselors. After a lot of grumbling, the counselor got out of bed and agreed to accompany her to the toilet. The girl opened the door and went in while the counselor waited for her outside. After a while, the counselor sensed something was wrong. He decided to check on Aniska, so he opened the door and he peeked inside and called out her name. To his astonishment, there was no answer. The toilet was empty, and the girl was gone. All he found was a playing card lying on the floor. Again, it was the Jack of Hearts. The police were called back to the camp, and when they arrived, they had a dog with them. A policeman took a pair of Aniska's dirty underwear and held it out so the dog could sniff it and pick up her scent. The dog tracked her as far as the toilet, but it refused to go any further, It seemed as if it was afraid of something. All of the children called their parents and asked them to come and take them home. Mila managed to contact her parents, but they said they were busy and they couldn't come. No matter how much she begged them to pick her up, it did no use. She was left there to fend for herself. Most of the kids in the camp were taken home by their parents. By the end of the day, there were only 7 children left. 3 boys, 3 girls, and Mila. Their parents had been unable to come. All of them gathered in one cabin to spend the night. As a precaution, 2 of the counselors would also sleep in the cabin to watch over them. Nobody was allowed to go to the outside toilet. If any of them needed to use the restroom, they would have to do it in a porcelain pot that was placed in the center of the room. They had to lift the lid, do their business, then put the lid back down so it didn't smell too badly. That night, Mila lay awake in bed, shaking with fear. She was terrified that she would be the next to disappear, and she dreaded having to go to the toilet in front of everybody. Eventually, all of the children drifted off into an uneasy slumber. The next morning when they woke up, there were 2 empty beds. 2 of the girls had mysteriously gone missing. Their names were Lishka and Galina. On the floor lay 2 playing cards. Both of them were the Jack of Hearts as well. The police arrived and began interrogating the 2 counselors. After hours of questioning, they determined the counselors didn't know anything. Another search of the area was conducted, but it once again proved fruitless. There was no trace of the missing children, and the police left empty-handed. One policeman decided to stay behind to protect the remaining kids. The only ones left now were 3 boys, a girl named Katka, and Mila. When they were going to bed, the policeman came into the cabin and locked the door behind him. He put a chair in front of the door and sat down on it. He planned to stay awake all night to make sure that nothing happened. He told the boys that they didn't need to worry. The kidnapper was only targeting girls. He said that Mila and Katka were the ones in danger, and if the kidnapper came back, he would probably try to abduct them. This terrified the 2 girls and they started crying, but the policeman assured them that he would do everything in his power to make sure that they were safe. In the middle of the night, Katka needed to go to the toilet. The policeman told her to go ahead and use the pot, but she refused and began to throw a tantrum. Eventually, the policeman gave in, and he agreed to escort her to the toilet. He figured since he was an officer of the law and had a firearm, it would be safe. He didn't want to let Mila out of his sight either, so he told her that she would have to come with them. The officer unlocked the door, slowly stuck his head out and looked both ways. Everything seemed quiet and everything seemed all right. He told the boys to lock the door behind him, and he cautiously led the 2 girls toward the outdoor toilet. He kept looking in all directions, making sure nobody could sneak up on them. Eventually, they reached the toilet. Mila and Katka were trembling. The policeman told them to go wait at the door while he checked all the stalls. He turned on his flashlight and took a look around. At first, everything seemed normal, but then he heard a rustling noise and he saw one of the stall doors slowly creaking open. Suddenly there was a loud hissing sound and a shadow flew out of the stall. It was a man dressed in a dark red bodysuit and mask. He caught hold of Katka by the hair and started to drag her away. Mila screamed. The policeman tried to protect the girls, but the shadowy figure grabbed him by the neck and began to choke him. Gasping for air and unable to defend himself, the policeman ordered Mila to go back to the cabin and get help. Mila ran as fast as she could, screaming and shouting. The camp counselors grabbed their flashlights and rushed out. The 3 boys in the cabin also came running to see if they could help. Mila screamed and pointed them towards the toilet. When they got to the outhouse, they saw the policeman lying on the ground. There was a strange man standing over him, his hands wrapped tightly around the policeman's neck. Katka was lying unconscious on the ground beside him. Finally, the policeman's struggle was successful, and he managed to pull out his gun. He pointed his gun, pulled the trigger, and the bullet ripped through the man's shoulder. With a loud roar, the man let go of the police officer, grabbed Katka's limp body, and took off running. The counselors pursued him, with the 3 boys and Mila close behind. The policeman stood up, took careful aim, and fired at the man, but he missed. Before he could get off another shot, the man had disappeared into the woods. Everyone started to look for the crazed kidnapper. They scoured the woods with their flashlights. Mila stayed close to the policeman. Tears were streaming down her face all the while. Just then, she happened to spot a trail of blood in the bushes. She pointed it out to the policeman, and once he noticed it, he told her to be extremely quiet. Peering from behind the bushes, he saw that there was a wooden hut camouflaged by leaves and undergrowth. He flagged down the counselors, and together they all approached the hut and slowly opened the door. When they saw what was inside, they were horrified and disgusted. The bodies of 5 young girls hung on the walls. They were tied up in different poses, and their heads dangled at odd angles. They had all been strangled to death, and their necks were broken. Mila immediately started crying. She recognized the girls. They were her friends, Svetlana, Aniska, Lishka, Galina, and Katka. The policeman immediately contacted his superiors on the radio and reported what he had found. As dawn approached, the woods were swarming with police officers. They searched and searched, but they never managed to track down the killer. The policeman called Mila's parents personally and shouted at them down the phone, demanding that they come pick up their daughter. Mila was finally able to relax and breathe a sigh of relief. After this, the owners of the camp were forced to close down, and the surviving children were sent home. In the end, the summer camp had to close down for good. A lot of money changed hands, and the owners had to pay compensation to the parents of the dead girls. The authorities tried to have the whole incident hushed up, but rumors began to spread, and pretty soon it was being reported in the tabloid newspapers. The murderer was never caught. The papers gave him the nickname, the Jack of Hearts, and they say that he's still out there in the woods, biding his time and waiting for more young girls to wander into his clutches. One summer, a girl moved into the house next door. She lived with her mother and they were quite poor. Her father had abandoned them years before. She was new in town and found it quite hard to adjust. Although she and I both came from different backgrounds, she and I also got to be friends. We were not very close friends, but I often visited her house and we would talk. The moment I laid eyes on her, I knew she was the perfect girl for me. Unfortunately, she didn't seem to feel the same way. She was attracted to boys who were handsome and confident, and it was clear that I wasn't her type, so I just decided to wait. She didn't have any friends of her own to talk to, so she confided in me a lot. Mostly, she would complain about her life, telling me how her mother hit her, and how the girls in her class were mean and always excluded her. She also told me about a boy she had a crush on. He was very popular with the girls in the school. As she talked about her problems, I just sat there and listened. One day, the girl stopped coming to school. As it turned out, it was because she was being bullied. She told me that one of the popular girls in school had found out that she had a crush on her boyfriend, so the popular girl and her friends would bully her every time they saw her. She said they even spread vile rumors about her to the other classmates, and they were making her life a living nightmare. I just quietly sat there and listened as she vented all of her problems to me. Her behavior began to change after she entered junior high school. She stayed out until all hours of the night and began to smoke cigarettes and drink alcohol. I heard rumors that she was doing drugs too, but it's hard to know if that's the truth. Either way, she fell in with a bad crowd and was even arrested by the police once. Her home life grew even worse, and she would frequently quarrel with her mother in the middle of the night. All of the girls in school hated her. Somebody sprayed graffiti all over their house, calling her horrible names and spraying disgusting things about her too. Somebody even apparently killed their pet cat and stuffed it through the letterbox on their door. Eventually, the girl dropped out of high school. She became withdrawn and locked herself into her bedroom. She stopped speaking to her mother and went for days without leaving her room. She rarely even came out to eat. She started to look pale, sickly, and painfully thin. Her mother took to leaving food outside of her door instead of just repairing the relationship. She would only come out when she needed to use the toilet or in the middle of the night when her mother was asleep. Kinda sounds like a completely miserable life, really. Not too long ago, I went to see her again for the first time in a long time. She refused to come out to see me, and even though I yelled through the keyhole, she refused to answer. Her mother gave me a bowl of soup to take upstairs to her. I caught a glimpse of her when she opened the door to take the soup. She was extremely pale, drawn, haggard, and pretty much emaciated. She looked like a wet rag that had been wrung out. After that, I went to see her every day, and after a while, she began to talk to me through the door. She told me how she was constantly fighting with her mother and that all of her old friends had forgotten about her. She told me about how she had fallen in with that bad crowd and how she went out with them at night, stealing, doing drugs, and getting into trouble. She told me that she got caught shoplifting by the police and now she had a criminal record. She told me a lot of things. She told me about how her mother tried to help her at first, but when she wouldn't listen, her mother flew into a rage and beat her. Her life had just kind of become unbearable to her. She said she wanted to die, and she told me that she tried to commit suicide a couple of times by slitting her wrists. Just like the old days, she continued to talk on, and I just sat there and listened. Whenever she asked me for my opinion, I just shrugged or made some pointless, innocuous remark. As the time went by, the girl's mood gradually began to brighten. She even decided to come out of her room. It seemed like things were getting better and the future was looking positive for her. Her mother loved seeing this change in her, and she broke down in tears and began to thank me profusely. One day, that same girl went up to the roof on an apartment building in the neighborhood and jumped off of it. The building wasn't very high, and she landed in a shrubbery. That's probably what saved her life, but her spinal cord was injured in the fall, and she was paralyzed from the neck down. The doctor said that she'd spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. When she got out of the hospital, I went to see her. She was lying in her bed, unable to move. She apologized to me over and over, and she couldn't stop crying. She said that she wished she didn't survive the fall, and she told me that she was sorry for all the trouble she had caused me and her mother. I tried to soothe her and stop her crying, but it's hard to comfort someone when they're laying down, so I just embraced her awkwardly. She was weeping so much that her whole body was shaking. She couldn't even wipe away her own tears. As I held her in my arms, I asked her if she would marry me. She looked at me and said, "Really? Are you serious? Me? Really?" She couldn't believe that anyone would want her. I had to propose to her several times before she would believe I really meant it. She cried so hard her tears ran dry. I tried to reassure her, and I told her I wanted to marry her because I'd always loved her. She was the perfect girl for me. She had always been the perfect girl for me, even when she ignored me and didn't return my feelings, even when she was hanging out with a bad crowd, even when I had to listen to all of her stupid problems, even though they were problems that she created herself, even when she became so thin and was hiding in her room, even when I told the popular girl that she fancied her boyfriend, even when I was spreading vile rumors about her to all of her classmates, even when I sprayed graffiti all over her house, even when I killed her cat and put it through the letterbox of her house, even now that she's lying there in bed, small, weak, and unable to move. Even now, I still love her. You see, she's the perfect girl for me. She always has been. She said yes. Soon, we'll be married. Through the eyes of a child, the world is very different. Every child has a fear of what's lurking under their bed. They fear what is hiding in the closet or peeping in at them through the little crack in a door that's standing ajar. A doctor would tell you that children are much more perceptive than adults. Their eyes are able to see the things that an adult's eyes cannot see. When you grow up, you become blind to the dangers that creep and crawl through the darkness. Children can see what's truly there. They see the monsters. If you were to look, for just one night, through a child's eyes, you would know what true fear really is. If you were able to see again the things you only dimly remember from your childhood, imagine how terrifying that would be. Can you remember those sleepless nights, burrowing under your covers, shaking and shivering in the darkness, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound, afraid to breathe even? Those are the nights that the adults forget. The nights when you would cover yourself completely with your blankets so that the monsters couldn't see you. The nights when you would hold your breath so the monsters couldn't hear you. The nights when you would lie as still as possible so you wouldn't attract their attention. I know you remember those nights. The only thing that would protect you was light, bright light. You slept with the light on. That made it safe. That meant that the monsters couldn't get to you. Teenagers are caught somewhere in the middle. They still sense that something is there in the darkness, but they try to convince themselves that it's just their imagination. They're embarrassed to sleep with the light on. Teenagers have forgotten that the light is the only thing that can keep them away. While you're sitting there in front of your computer or your cell phone, do you think that the light from the monitor will be enough to keep them away? Sorry, it's not. I assure you of that. Now go ahead and look behind you with child's eyes and try not to scream. One day, a boy was sitting in his classroom in school. He was extremely bored and was waiting for the school bell to ring. When he looked out the window, something caught his eye. There was a photograph lying on the grass outside. When school was over, he ran outside and picked up the photograph before anyone else had a chance to see it and pick it up. Turning it over in his hands, he realized it was a picture of an incredibly beautiful girl. She was wearing a white top, a short black skirt, black tights, and black shoes. For some reason, she was holding up 2 fingers. The girl was so pretty that he wanted to meet her. He showed her photograph to everyone in the school and asked if they knew her. Unfortunately, nobody recognized her. That night when he went to bed, he placed the photo on his bedside table and went to sleep. Around midnight, he woke up. There was something tapping on his window. Then he heard what sounded like some kind of giggling. More than just a little frightened, he worked up the courage to investigate it. He crawled out of bed, went over to the window, opened the shades, and saw that there was nothing there. The next day, he showed the photo to his friends and neighbors and asked if they knew the mysterious girl. Everybody he asked said that they had never seen the girl before in their lives. That night as he lay in bed, he heard the tapping sound again. He looked out the window, and he could just barely make out a figure standing on the other side of the street. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like it might have been a mysterious girl in the photograph. He reached over to his nightstand, grabbed the picture, clutched it tightly, threw on his clothes and raced downstairs and out the front door. As he crossed the road, he forgot to look both ways and was suddenly hit by a car. The driver got out of the car and ran over to help the boy, but it was of no use. The boy had been killed on impact. The driver noticed something clutched in the boy's hand. It was a photograph. Turning it over in his hands, the driver realized it was a picture of an incredibly beautiful girl. She was wearing a black top, a short black skirt, black tights, and black shoes. For some reason in the photo, she was holding up 3 fingers. There was a very famous author named David who had written quite a few best-selling horror novels. All of the literary critics praised his talent for plot twists and surprise endings. He received a large amount of fan mail every day, and some budding authors even sent him manuscripts in hopes that he would help them get their work published. While David took pleasure in responding to letters from his fans, he took even more pleasure in stealing the ideas from the amateur writers. If he came across a manuscript with a great idea for a scary story, he would use it in one of his own books and deny the author any credit. Then, in order to hide his theft, he pulled some strings with his friends in the publishing industry to make sure that the original author never got anything published in the future. One day, David received a new manuscript in the mail. It was bound in a beautiful hardcover book. He read the first chapter and felt that he knew how the story would end. As he continued reading, he became more and more certain that he could guess the twist ending. It was growing late, but he wanted to finish reading the manuscript to see whether he was right or not. When David came to the final chapter, he realized that the last few pages of the book were stuck together. Anxious to read further, he pulled the pages apart. He felt increasingly tired, but he still kept reading. Finally, he came to the end of the book. It was exactly the twist ending he had anticipated. The husband had hanged himself just as his wife was committing suicide in the next room. David made a mental note to steal the idea and use it in his next story. Just then, he noticed that after the words "the end," there was a little handwritten comment from the author, which read, "I already know that you're planning to steal the ideas in this story. I know because you did the exact thing to me the last time I sent you a manuscript. You published it under your own name and didn't give me any credit. You ripped me off and blackmailed me in the industry. Nobody will accept my novels anymore, and I will never again be able to publish anything I write. You've ruined my life, and now I'm going to have my revenge." You had to pull apart the back pages in order to read this, didn't you? Well, those pages contained a poison. Arsenic, to be precise. Are you feeling tired? That's normal. It's one of the symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Soon, your heartbeat will get slower and slower until it eventually stops permanently. Don't bother trying to call an ambulance. You'll be dead long before they arrive. You've already been exposed for too long. Goodbye, David. Some twist endings can be very hard to predict. A husband and wife were at home one evening when they heard a knock on the door. When they went to answer it, there was a strange gentleman standing on the doorstep. He was dressed in an expensive black suit and he was holding a large briefcase. "I wonder if I might have a few moments of your time," he said. Assuming he was a traveling salesman, they invited him in. The gentleman placed his briefcase down on the kitchen table and took something out. It was a box with a single red button on the top. He handed the box to the husband and wife. "Today is your lucky day," he said in a calm tone. "You have an opportunity to become rich beyond your wildest imagination. If you press this button, you will receive $1 million cash. There's just one catch. Someone you don't know will die." Saying that, the gentleman opened his briefcase and showed them the stacks of money inside. The gentleman told them he would return the next day to collect the box. After he had left, the husband and wife discussed the box. They argued for hours. Eventually, they decided to press the button. Nothing happened. The next day, the gentleman came back. He asked for the box, and in exchange, he gave them the case worth $1 million. As he was about to leave, the husband asked, "Did someone really die?" "Of course," the gentleman replied. "It happened last night, in a distant place. Someone you don't know died." The husband felt guilty. His conscience was eating at him. "One more question," he said. "Yes, what do you want to know?" said the gentleman. "What are you going to do with the box now?" The gentleman smiled and said, "I'm going to give it to someone who doesn't know you." My grandfather came from Russia. He was born in Leningrad and lived there during World War II. When we were kids, he told us many stories about his own childhood. There was one story in particular that absolutely horrified me. He told it only once and refused to speak about it again, but he swore that it was true. During World War II, in September of 1941, the German army had surrounded the city of Leningrad and blocked off all the roads. No one could get in or out. They called it the Siege of Leningrad, and it was one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history. Hitler was determined to seize the city, and he didn't care how many buildings he had to destroy, or how many innocent people he had to kill. In fact, his plan was to cut off all supplies and starve the entire population to death. After a year of this, over 100,000 people were dead, and the streets were littered with rotting corpses. At the time of the siege of Leningrad, my grandfather was only 6 years old. He lived in an apartment building near the center of the city with his mother and his 2 older sisters. At first he said it was not so difficult, but then the food began to run out. With each passing day, it became harder and harder to survive. There was barely anything to eat, and some days he managed to get a crust of bread, but other days he had to go hungry, not eating at all. The city was in absolute chaos. People there began eating animals and pets. If they could catch a stray dog or a stray cat or rats or whatever else, they would eat them. When there were no animals left, my grandfather said, that's when the cannibalism began. On the first floor of the building where my grandfather was living, there were 4 apartments. All of them were inhabited. My grandfather and his family lived in the first 2 apartments. The second was occupied by a woman and her 2 sons, and the third was occupied by a man and his wife. 2 middle-aged sisters who had never married were living together in the 4th apartment. One night my grandfather was lying awake in bed, unable to sleep with the hunger. All of a sudden he heard terrible screams and cries for help, which woke the whole family. It sounded like they were coming from one of the neighboring apartments. His mother's name was Zenaida, and she was a very brave woman. She decided to check what was going on despite the pleas of her frightened children. She gave them strict instructions to lock the door and not to open it for anyone. She left and the children did as they were told. Standing in the corridor, his mother noticed that the door of the next apartment was slightly ajar. This one was occupied by a woman who had 2 young sons. Zenaida walked slowly to the door and cautiously peered inside. What she saw in there would haunt her for the rest of her life. Scared to death, she ran back to her own apartment and begged her children to let her back in. When my grandfather and his sisters opened the door, their mother burst in and slammed it shut behind her. She was out of breath and her face was very pale. She got the kids to help her barricade the door, and only then would she tell them what she'd seen. On the floor, in a pool of blood, there lay a severed hand, she said. There was a sickening stench of blood, and from the depths of the apartment, I could hear disgusting chomping sounds. When they heard that, the older sisters became very upset. My grandfather was so terrified, he ran to the bedroom and hid under the bed. The next day, when his mother went out into the corridor again to take a look around, she saw that the door of the next apartment was firmly closed. Everything was deathly silent. After several weeks, the situation in the city improved a little bit. The Russian army managed to open up one narrow supply route, so some food was able to get through. None of my grandfather's family had died from starvation, but they were all very weak. At some point, his mother gathered together what little money they had and went to see if there was any food she could buy in the streets. When she came back, she noticed that the door of the third apartment was hanging on one hinge. This one was occupied by a man and his wife. Guessing what happened there, Zenaida pushed the door open and peeked inside. In the dim light, she could just make out two crumpled figures lying on the floor. Most of the meat had been stripped from their bones. Sick to her stomach and scared out of her mind, she returned to her own apartment. After telling her children about the horrible news, she barricaded the door once again. However, she knew that they couldn't continue like this for long. Soon, their meager food supplies would run out. They had to get more or they would certainly starve to death. Zenaida once again summoned the strength to get up and leave the apartment. No sooner had she taken a couple of steps down the corridor than she saw the door on the fourth apartment open up. There were two middle-aged sisters living there, and one of them came out. The woman looked unusually good. All the residents of the city were very thin and emaciated, but this woman looked healthy, and maybe even a little fat. The woman smiled and said, "Hello," and then she started walking towards Zenaida. Something about the woman's manner set her on edge, and she began to slowly back away. Looking over her shoulder, she caught sight of the second sister, who was creeping up behind her. The second sister was clutching a huge axe in her hands. Zenaida let out a strangled scream. She was trapped in the corridor and there was nowhere she could run. The two sisters closed in, licking their lips in anticipation of their next meal. Thankfully, salvation came unexpectedly. As it turned out, my grandfather's older sister saw what was happening, and at that very moment, a group of Russian soldiers were passing by on the street outside. The children opened the window and called out to them, screaming and begging them to come to the rescue. Without thinking twice, the soldiers ran into the entrance and quickly made their way up the stairs. When they came to the first floor, they saw the two fat women trying to drag a skinny woman into an apartment. The soldiers leveled their rifles and ordered the women to stop fighting. The fat woman with the axe took a swing at the soldiers, and they shot her right between the eyes, blowing her brains all over the wall. The soldiers then ordered the other two women to lie down on the floor and began questioning them. Zenaida burst into tears and told them that the two sisters were cannibals and that they had already eaten the inhabitants of the two apartments and were about to eat the tenants of a third. When the soldiers searched the other apartments and came across the half-eaten remains, they realized that Zenaida was telling the truth. Thus, the soldiers rescued my great-grandmother and her family. They ordered the remaining sister to kneel down on the ground and executed her on the spot with a bullet to the back of the head. That was the punishment for cannibalism at the time. Just 1 year later, the Russian army managed to push the Germans back and the siege of Leningrad ended. Over 1,500,000 people had died and another 1,500,000 had been evacuated. Somehow, my grandfather and his family managed to survive the whole thing. After all, those two fat sisters, they definitely had a lot of meat on their bones. I want to tell you a story about my last girlfriend. We met at university. We accidentally bumped into each other in the hallway. She asked me to go for a coffee with her and I agreed. She told me her name was Norma. We talked about this and that. She was very pretty and witty. I was very attracted to her and before long we were dating. Norma was a very sensitive and caring woman, not like my other previous girlfriends. It was like she was from another planet. She was always interested in what I wanted, always concerned about my needs, but at the same time she was very feminine. I felt really good around her. Everything was fine at first. It was my friend's birthday and our whole group gathered in a bar to celebrate. I was excited because I brought Norma and I wanted to introduce her to everyone. Sitting at the table we were having fun, drinking and laughing. Some of the other group went outside to smoke, and Norma went with them. They were gone for 5 minutes, and when they returned, I was approached by my friend Simon. "Hey, I think there's something wrong with that Norma girl," he said. "What do you mean?" I asked him. "Well, she's kind of strange. She started talking about her mother, saying really weird things, and then started giggling like an idiot for no reason. She's not normal." "Norma? Not normal? Are you sure?" Of course I spoke with Norma about it, but she denied everything. She said my guy friends were just jealous of our relationship and they were trying to drive a wedge between us. I believed her, especially since Simon had asked one of my ex-girlfriends out on a date one time. It was possible that he wanted to turn me against Norma so he could ask her out on a date as well. But the more time I spent with Norma, the more I started to notice some strange behavior. Sometimes she would get a faraway look in her eyes and go silent for a few minutes. Then she would start talking again as if nothing had happened, and she began to call me Daddy. I put up with her little eccentricities because everything else in the relationship was wonderful. And then something strange happened. It was like a bolt out of the blue. One day, she tried to kidnap me. We were at my house and my parents were out. I went upstairs to get something, and all of a sudden I feel her grab me from behind and put a handkerchief over my nose and mouth. It was soaked in some kind of chemical, and within seconds I blacked out. When I woke up, I was in some shabby apartment with a dirty rag stuffed in my mouth. My arms and legs were tied to the bed and I had this terrible headache. Norma came in and she put her finger to her lips and pulled the rag from my mouth. I immediately screamed for help, and Norma slapped me across the face really hard. "Don't you dare cry or yell for help," she growled. "My father never cried, okay?" She untied my hands and gave me a withering look. She told me that if I tried to run away or scream again, things would only get worse. Norma took me into the kitchen and sat me down at the table. She put a plate of food in front of me and told me to eat. All that time, she didn't take her eyes off of me for a second, so I just did as she told me. When I looked into Norma's eyes, I could see that she was a complete psycho. How could I have not ever seen this in her before? She just sat there and smiled at me as if everything was normal. "How are things at work, Daddy?" she asked me. This was strange and terrifying, and I felt like I had no other choice but to play along with her. "All good," I replied. "So, we'll go on a holiday together next week?" Oh yeah, of course," I mumbled. "Oh, by the way, somebody told me you have a new woman in your life, Daddy. That's not true, is it? You wouldn't do that to me, would you, Daddy?" I saw how angrily she was staring at me. "No," I replied. "Well, I knew it wasn't true," she grinned. "We don't need anybody else. We're happy together, just you and me." After I finished eating, she took me into the bedroom and forced me onto the bed. She tied my hands and put a gag in my mouth and left. This was how my nightmare began. Sometimes Norma remained with me for a long time, telling me how things were going in college. She always called me Dad or Daddy. I went along with it because I was afraid of what she might do if I resisted. If I made one mistake, she would beat me terribly. I was stuck in that dingy apartment for 6 whole days. The door of the room was always locked and there was no clock, so I had to guess what time it was. Norma would come and go. I don't know where she got the money, but she always brought me food and sweets. She always said, "I love my daddy and I want to make him happy. A girl's best friend is her father." I knew that this couldn't go on. My parents and my friends were probably worried sick. I wondered if they had contacted the police already. I wondered if anybody was looking for me even. One time I tried to reason with her. I tried to explain that I wasn't her father and that she needed to let me go, but she beat me again like crazy. On the 6th day, Norma woke me up as usual and told me that she was going out to buy us breakfast. I heard the front door close and I started trying to free myself. I felt like I could move my right hand a little bit. The rope over there had become a little bit looser. It took me about 20 minutes, but I managed to work it free. I quickly untied myself and rushed out the door, but of course, it was firmly locked. I ran to the window and looked out. I was on the 5th floor. I grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. With a loud crash, the glass broke and the chair landed on the pavement outside, almost hitting some passers-by. Leaning out the window, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help me! She's gonna kill me! Help! She's a psycho!" And then I saw her. Norma was standing in the street with a bag in her hand, glaring up at me. By the look in her eyes, I knew the only thing she wanted now was to kill me. People were gathering under the window, so my crazy girlfriend just turned and ran off. 10 minutes later, a police car arrived. The officers broke the door down and rescued me. I will never forget the look in my parents' eyes when they took me home. I spent the rest of the night weeping uncontrollably. This kind of thing can't happen to a man, can it? Well, it can, and it did. It turned out that the police were already looking for Norma. She was on the run from authorities long before we met. She was wanted for a double murder. Her name wasn't even Norma. It was Edna, and she was actually 30 years old. She had a history of mental illness and had been in and out of insane asylums for most of her life. 2 years before, she'd been living with her father. She was completely obsessed with him. Her father had been dating a woman, and he brought her home with him one night. When Norma caught them together, she flew into a violent rage. She beat both of them to death with a hammer, and then just disappeared. I hope the police will find her soon, because until they do, I'm too scared to leave my house. If I can give you any advice, be very careful of who you date. I'm a 16-year-old and I live in a small town in Russia. My father doesn't make a lot of money and my family isn't very wealthy. There are a lot of things we can't afford. One of those things is the internet. One day while I was in school, one of my friends told me she had heard about a new service that gives you free access to the internet. She said that all you had to do was connect to their network, which was called free Wi-Fi, and then you could browse the internet to your heart's content without having to pay a thing. It sounded almost too good to be true. That evening when I got home, I decided to try it out. I opened up my laptop and searched for the network called free Wi-Fi. The signal was excellent, so I selected it and clicked connect. My internet browser popped up, and on a black background with sinister red letters there was a message. Welcome to free Wi-Fi. Thank you for visiting. We don't require any payment. We don't require any registration. All we ask for is some basic information about our visitors. Please answer the following question. There were 4 pictures on the page: a bus, a boat, a train, and a plane. Underneath there was a question. What is your usual mode of transport? I cycled to school. My father didn't own a car, and we could never afford to go anywhere on holiday. I didn't use any of those modes of transportation, so I just chose the train at random and clicked on it. A thank you message appeared on the screen, and then I was able to browse the internet. I was delighted. This was the answer to all my problems. Now I could set up a Facebook account and keep in touch with my friends on Twitter and Instagram. The next day, however, as I was watching TV, the show was interrupted by a breaking news alert. The local news reporter was saying that there had been a terrible accident. A train had derailed and come off the tracks just as it was crossing a bridge. Several carriages plunged into the river below, and almost everyone on board had been killed. I was horrified. That's when I remembered the website I had visited the night before. I'd selected the picture of the train. I tried to tell myself that it was just a coincidence. I mean, What would have happened if I chose the picture of the plane? Would there have been a plane crash the next day? The idea was ludicrous. That evening, I needed to use the internet again. I connected to the free Wi-Fi network, and again, the same page popped up. This time the question was different. There were 4 pictures of houses: a bungalow, a 2-story house, a 3-story house, and an apartment building. Underneath, in big red sinister letters, was the question: which type of house do you live in? My family lives in the bungalow, and I was about to choose that option when I stopped myself. My finger hovered over the mouse button, but I couldn't click it. What if my suspicions were true? It was a silly thought, but I just couldn't take that chance. Instead, I clicked on the apartment building just to be safe. A thank you message flashed on the screen again, and I was able to connect to the internet. The next day, an apartment building near my school burned down. Luckily, the fire happened during the day, so most people weren't home. About 20 people perished in the blaze. The police said that they suspected arson. I was worried. It was starting to seem like more and more than a coincidence. No matter how crazy it seemed, I had a sneaking suspicion that somehow the free Wi-Fi was causing these tragedies. I decided that I would be better off if I just left it alone. However, that night, I began to doubt myself. The more I thought about it, the sillier it seemed. Was I just being paranoid? How could connecting to a free Wi-Fi network result in the death of over 100 people? Who would ever believe that such a thing was possible? After mulling it over for almost an hour, I was convinced it was just an insane coincidence. I took out my laptop, turned it on, and connected to the free Wi-Fi. My internet browser popped open again. There were 4 more pictures. When I saw them, I let out a gasp of horror. The pictures were of my mother, my father, my little sister, and me. Underneath, in big sinister red letters, was the question: which of these is your favorite family member? It was the end of October, and a young boy named Sean was in the hospital. He should have been picking out a Halloween costume and enjoying himself with his friends, but instead, he was stuck in a hospital, waiting to have his tonsils removed. His parents spoke to the receptionist, and a nurse led them down the hallway to the room where Sean was going to be staying. The lime green walls were all decorated with orange and black streamers, white skulls, and paper cutout pumpkin heads. When they reached the hospital room, they heard a big commotion. There was a boy lying in one of the beds, and he was screaming, "I'm not Kevin! I'm not Kevin!" 2 other nurses were trying to calm him down. One held a big syringe, and the other prepared his arm to give him an injection. They quickly pulled the curtains around his bed. The screaming gradually stopped, and when the nurses opened the curtains again, the boy was lying unconscious in his bed. Sean was curious and asked the nurse what was wrong with the boy. "He's having his leg amputated in the morning," she said. "The poor boy is so nervous about it that he's trying to convince us that he's not himself. He thinks that if he says he's not Kevin, he won't have the operation." "Are you sure you have the right person?" Sean asked. "Of course," replied the nurse. "His name's Kevin. It's right there on his chart." Sean's parents left, and he sat on the edge of his bed reading a book. Another nurse came around with the trolley to serve dinner, but he could only stoach a few mouthfuls. The hospital food here was disgusting. He lay on the bed for a while, staring at the ceiling. He was bored out of his mind. Just then, he noticed that Kevin was waking up. "Hey, Kevin," he said. "My name's Sean. I'm your new roommate." "I'm not Kevin," the boy groaned as he rubbed his head. Sean tried to have a conversation with him, but the boy was irritated and he didn't want to talk. He just sat there, silently brooding. At 10 o'clock, a nurse came in and told him it was time to go to sleep. She said good night to them and turned off the lights. Just before the lights went out, Sean noticed the other boy staring at him with an odd look on his face. He soon dozed off, but his sleep was haunted by strange dreams. When Sean woke up the next morning, there were two doctors leaning over his bed. "Let's go, Kevin," said one of them. "It's time for your surgery." Sean was confused. "What? But I'm not Kevin," he replied. "Oh, the nurses warned us about you," the other doctor replied. "They told us that you'd say that." "You're making a big mistake," Sean insisted. "I'm telling you, I'm not Kevin." One doctor reached out and checked a medical chart at the end of the bed. "Of course you are," he replied. "It says so right here in your chart." "That's not right," Sean screamed. "Somebody must have switched them." He started to struggle, but the doctors held him down and put him in a straitjacket. As they placed him in a wheelchair and took him away, Sean was still screaming, "I'm not Kevin! I'm not Kevin!" The last thing he saw as they wheeled him out the door was the smiling face of the real Kevin. One evening, a young woman named Betty was home alone when she heard a knock at her front door. She opened it and found a young man standing there on the doorstep. He told her that his car had broken down and he asked if he could come in and make a phone call because his cell phone battery had run out. Betty was a friendly young woman and she readily agreed to help him. After he made his phone call, she offered him a drink. They sat down in the lounge and began to discuss anything and everything. Their conversation continued long into the night. As it was getting late, Betty yawned and told the young man that it was probably time for him to go home. However, he ignored her and he continued to talk about his passion for movies. He listed all the movies he had seen recently and asked her opinion about them. He continued to talk and brought up the subject of video nasties. Betty didn't know what that meant. He explained that a video nasty was a film in which a person was actually murdered. No special effects, no camera tricks. Everything was real. Betty began to get a little creeped out and explained that she had been terrified when she watched one horror movie in particular. It was the morbid story of a young woman who was trapped by three psychopaths who left the camera running as they killed her and chopped her up. The man began to talk more and more about video nasties, and the longer he spoke, the more uneasy she became. While he was talking, Betty's attention was suddenly drawn by a peculiar red glow under the jacket of her guest. Her face grew pale when she realized it was the unmistakable red light of a camera that was recording her. When I was 12 years old, I had a best friend named Brenda. After school, we always went to her house to hang out. She lived in a big house on the edge of town. One day, Brenda didn't show up for school. She was absent for the next few days, and I began wondering if there was something wrong with her. After she'd missed a whole week of school, I decided to pay her a visit. I cycled all the way across town and arrived at her house just as it was getting dark outside. When I rang the doorbell, I got a shock when the door opened almost immediately. Brenda's mother was standing in the doorway, but there was something strange about her. Her eyes seemed darker than usual, and her hair was hanging loose around her shoulders. I noticed that she was wearing a bathrobe. The most unsettling thing is the way she was just staring at me and grinning. She didn't say a word. She just stood there staring at me with an evil smile playing across her lips. "Is Brenda here?" I asked nervously. She beckoned at me to come in, and before I could say anything, she'd slipped back into the darkened house. As I stepped inside, my eyes strained to see in the darkness, but I wasn't sure where she had gone. Just then, I heard a strange humming sound and I followed it into the kitchen. I found her there, standing at the kitchen sink with her back towards me. The moment I entered the kitchen, she stopped humming, and there was an eerie silence. I took a seat at the kitchen table and waited. She seemed to be taking forever. I spent the next 5 minutes just sitting there, staring at her and wondering what was going on. And then I realized something very odd. The whole time I'd been sitting there, she hadn't moved a muscle. Her back was still towards me, and I couldn't see her face. Her hands hung limp by her sides, and her head was tilted slightly. Yeah, something was very wrong. I stood up nervously and I approached her. She remained completely still. Ever so slowly, I moved around her and I tried to get a look at her face to see if she was all right. The sight still haunts me to this very day. Her eyes were wide open and she still had that evil grin on her face. I was so freaked out that I couldn't bear stay in that kitchen a moment longer. Without saying a word, I backed out of the room and made my way towards the front door. I jumped on my bike and I began cycling as fast as I could down the long winding driveway and all the way back across town. I didn't stop once until I reached the safety of my house. It wasn't until a few days later that I found out why my friend Brenda had been absent from school. My parents told me that there had been a tragic death in Brenda's family. What? Who died? I asked my parents. My parents broke the sad news to me, and it made my hair stand up on end, and I started crying from fright. Brenda's mother had died suddenly, and the night I called over to her house, Brenda had been at her grandparents' place attending the funeral. Years later, when I was 16 years old, I made a little extra money by working as a babysitter on the weekends. One evening, a friend of mine called me and said that she knew a family who was desperately in need of a babysitter. She was busy and wanted to know if I was interested in babysitting for them instead. She told me that the parents were very nice, the pay was good, and their 3-year-old daughter was polite and well-behaved. I wasn't doing anything important, so I told her that I would be glad to take the job. That evening, I went to the family's house and I met the mother. Her name was Ruth, and she was getting ready to go out for the night with friends. She mentioned that her husband was out of town on business and gave me some numbers to call if I needed to get in touch with her. The night went very easily. I made dinner for the little girl, gave her a bubble bath, and then got her dressed for bed. It was around midnight when I heard the front door open and footsteps came down the hallway. I thought it was strange because I hadn't even heard a car pull up. Turning around, I was relieved to see Ruth making her way into the living room where I was sitting and watching TV. She never said a word to me, and as she walked past me, I was surprised by how different she looked. Something about her eyes had changed, and she was grinning from ear to ear. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew that evil grin. I'd seen it before, many years ago. Ruth sat at the dining table with her back turned towards me. Her hands hung limp down by her sides. Her head was cocked to the left, and she was humming to herself. "Ruth? Ruth?" I asked nervously. "Ruth, are you all right?" No answer. "Ruth, you're not alive anymore, are you?" Nothing but silence. With shaking hands, I quickly gathered my things and backed out of the room. When I got to the hallway, I opened the front door and looked outside. There was no car in the driveway. All of a sudden, the eerie silence was broken by the sound of a phone ringing. I didn't want to answer it. I was afraid of what I might hear. For a moment, my hand seemed to hover over the phone. Then I lifted the receiver and I put it to my ear. I already knew who it was. It was the police, calling to tell me that Ruth had been involved in a car accident an hour ago. She'd been killed on impact. Tears were streaming down my face as I ran upstairs, grabbed Ruth's daughter from her bed, and bundled her up in a blanket. As I came back downstairs, I had to pass by the door to the living room. I could still see Ruth sitting at the table with her back to me. Without pausing for 1 second, I ran out into the night, carrying the little girl in my arms. There was a young couple who had just gotten married. The wedding was wonderful, and they took many photos so that they would remember the happy occasion forever. For their honeymoon, they traveled to France and stayed in a dark old mansion. The first night, the young woman felt scared, and despite her husband's attempts to reassure her, she could not sleep. To clear her head, she decided to go downstairs to the library and read a little. She selected a book at random from the dusty old shelves and opened it. Inside there were only pictures. Pictures of her. The pictures were from her wedding. The woman was shocked at first, but then she thought about it. Her husband must have put together a wedding album as a surprise for her. He was probably planning to give it to her the next day. She flipped through the pictures in the album, her mind going back to how wonderful the wedding day had been. When she reached the end of the album, there were more pages with pictures, but they were not of the wedding. In fact, she wondered what these strange pictures were doing in the album. It seemed as if they had been stapled in. The first page showed a picture of a woman standing in the library, holding a book in her hands. On the second page, there was another picture of the woman, but this time the library door was open. Feeling a little uneasy, she turned to look at the door. It was closed. On the third page of the book, the door was wide open and a faceless man was standing behind the woman. Again, she glanced over her shoulder, but the door was still closed. Flipping to the last page of the book, she saw that in the picture, the faceless man was standing right behind the woman. His arm was raised and he was clutching a cleaver. The next morning, the husband woke up and could not find his wife. He decided to search the house, but when he got to the library, he found the door wouldn't open. It was stuck. Putting all of his weight behind it, he pushed against the door with his shoulder, and eventually it burst open. Behind the door, he found his wife lying in a pool of blood. There was a cleaver sticking out of the back of her head. We hope you were thoroughly creeped out by this collection of tales. We'll see you again soon, but until then, sweet dreams.